In this video, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to the logging mechanisms available in MariaDB, and then I'll have a demonstration video that shows you how to configure this logging and what this looks like in the real world. But I just want to give you a quick overview of logging. So first, we have error conditions in SQL. So when you're actually in MariaDB or MySQL and most DB engines, right? So most of the relational database systems work this way. As you run database statements, or SQL statements, whether it's for simple management of the database itself, or if you're doing DML or DDL statements, you'll get messages that come back that will tell you, and you've probably seen them, where it'll say X number of rows were affected, and you have X number of warnings, X number of errors, right? So those are the standard error conditions. And each database engine, I think, kind of has their own mechanism to manage these, but in MariaDB, error number 00000, right? So 5 zeros just means success. But if it's 01, the first two digits, that's a warning, and then the next three digits are the warning number. So if you're used to Oracle, you have these ORA, messages that come back, and it's a similar mechanism, right? So it works very similar. You can also, so you have the error number, but then you also have an actual error message, and that is a human readable error, right? So it tells you in human terms what happened. And really, it's just, for most database engines, it's just a translation of those error numbers, right? So those error numbers all mean something, and this is just the database. You can think of it as a data dictionary of the description of those error messages. And we'll see what that looks like when we do some hands-on demonstration here. You'll always see these when you're running SQL commands in the SQL console or the client. And if you want to see the warnings and errors, you can type show warnings or show errors, and it will show you those warnings and error messages. And you can even look at those, even if it's, sometimes you get a warning, but it doesn't really show it to you. It just says, statement ran successfully, X number of rows affected, and then it'll say 2 warnings. And then you can go and look at those warnings if you wanted to. I think by default, MariaDB will show the error messages. So if there is an error, by default, it's going to show you that in the client. And I'm not sure that there's a way to suppress that, but again, it'll show you that by default. When you're using an application to work with the database, right? So when you write database applications like in PHP, Python, Perl, C++, whatever, most of the libraries that you use with the API for the database engine also return the warnings and errors. As it returns the number, the error message, any custom errors, and you can access those. So a lot of times you'll do when you're writing application code, you'll have a try catch, or you'll have some conditional that's going to catch those errors and display them for the user maybe. And sometimes you don't display them for the user because it could be a security risk, right? Because it might expose information about the database engine or your database schema. But in any event, those debug messages are available for you to do something with them at the application layer as well. So again, that's all happening in real time. This is with the interaction with the database. There are also some diagnostics that you can access as well. It's a little bit cryptic how diagnostics work, so I'm not really going to cover that in the hands-on. And I don't know that it's terribly useful, but there's some stuff in the textbook that talks about diagnostics, so you can certainly take a look at. But the 3 main types of error logs that we're going to look at are your error log for the database engine itself, the system logs, and the query log. So the error log, according to all the documentation, right? So if you go look at the MariaDB documentation, or you go look at, our textbook, which, is very much based off of the MariaDB documentation, they'll tell you that the default location for the log is the data directory. But I think for most systems that are running Linux or Unix, you're going to find the log is going to be in var log MySQL. And I know it's MariaDB, right? But remember, a lot of it's, forked from MySQL, so we still have a lot of that vernacular. But and in our database engine, if you're using Google Cloud, which we're using for this course, you'll probably find that your error log by default is in var log MySQL, but that's configurable. So you can configure where that log file goes. The logs will actually contain each line of the log has a date, time, the message type, and the message type could be a note, a warning, or an error, and then you'll have the actual message. So notes are just informational. Warnings are, something the system wants you to know, but it's not necessarily preventing the system from working. And then an error means that, usually when you have an error, the database engine, cannot start up when you have an error. So if you're having trouble starting MariaDB, this is a good place to go look, right? It's probably going to tell you why it's not starting, and then you can start debugging from there and figuring out how to fix that problem. I'll talk more about debugging in another presentation. So as far as system logs go, MariaDB optionally can use the infrastructure, logging infrastructure that's baked into Linux and Windows. So in Windows, you have the Windows, you have the system log, right? The Windows logs that you can log stuff. So MariaDB, I think by default will use the Windows logs, and also in Linux, you can configure it to use the Linux logging mechanism. And what's nice about logging to var log is the whole logging infrastructure that's built into Linux and Unix manages those log files for you, right? So it does log rotation. Your book talks a little bit about log rotation, and of course, it's important to have some log rotation in place and log management. And there's lots of tools out there you can use to work with logs, like Splunk is a good tool for aggregating logs and getting more intelligence from log files. But again, all of that is compatible with MariaDB. But we're not going to do that in the lab. But what we are going to do in the lab is look at the query logs. And there's two types of query logs. One is the general query log. So that's going to show all the queries with the date and timestamp. So anytime somebody runs a SQL command, it's going to go into that query log. So you can go and see all the different queries. And that includes things like logging in and logging out, right? So connecting, you'll see when somebody connects to the server, you'll see what they do, and then you'll see them disconnect. And you can kind of piece that all together, what somebody's session looks like. The only thing I would tell you about that logging, it's got a lot of really good information in it. But two things that you have to be concerned with. Number one, that's going to grow very quickly, right? Because every single SQL statement is going to get written out to this log. Now, could you manage that with some kind of log rotation mechanism? Yeah, of course you can. But it also affects the performance of the database, right? If it has to log all of this stuff, there's some impact on the performance. Now, I believe that performance impact is minimal, but some experts will tell you that it's devastating, right? So it just depends on who you talk to. But in my experience, it's minimal impact on a well-designed database system. And there are certainly times that you need to have these query logs, right? If you have really stringent audit requirements, right? For example, it's a great way to do auditing. One of the neat things about these query logs is they don't necessarily have to be to a file. They could also be to a table. So if you're doing these query logs out to a table, then you could use a long-term archive somewhere, and you can move that data out to long-term archive periodically so that you can go and drill down into that table to look at activity over time. Or if you have to go back and audit something that happened, you've got the record of everything that an application was doing at a certain time. So you can, why were these records deleted, right? You could go and see which user did it, what were the statements that resulted in the deletion of those records, or was there no deletion statement, meaning somebody, something happened in the database engine itself, right? So it does give you a lot of capability, but what's more common is the slow query logs. So the slow query logs are sort of the best of both worlds. You're logging SQL statements, but you're only logging statements that meet certain traps that you identify as something problematic, right? So you're only logging problematic SQL queries. So these are queries that maybe have deadlocks or are too long or have errors, things like that. So you can set certain traps, and you'll see that there's some there are options in the config file that we can use to set those traps in the log files. So that's a little bit about the logging. And in another presentation, I also talk a little bit about troubleshooting methodology. Anytime we do troubleshooting, the first place you're going to get information, the only place really that you can get meaningful information for troubleshooting is the logs. I can't tell you how often I talk to people that are trying to troubleshoot issues, and I ask them, well, what did the log file say? And they say, oh, that's a good idea. I should go look at the logs. We should all be thinking, whenever there's an issue, whenever we're trying to figure anything out, we should be looking at the log files first to do our diagnostics. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the other presentation. Thank you.